Okay, thank you. Justin, go ahead.
All right. Well, Mayor Fuller, members of council, Mr. Grimes, I want to start by thanking you for the opportunity to serve on this committee and for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'd like to thank the city staff who worked on this project and to everyone who has served on this committee. I think our conversations have been fruitful. We've listened to each other with grace and understanding, and I think that's important on something like this. Everyone approaches this issue from a different perspective, and because of that, I understand that you have a difficult decision in front of you. James Webb Throckmorton was a complex man during a complex time, so I want to start out by recapping some of the things we know. He cast a vote against Texas secession from the Union, but he enslaved human beings. He saved a group of Union sympathizers from a hanging in Sherman, but served as a general in the Confederate Army. He advanced the economic interests of North Texas, but subjugated African Americans to a form of second-class citizenship by opposing the ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendments and passing laws known as black codes that would lead to the social order we know as Jim Crow. He was removed from governorship after a year in office for being an impediment to Reconstruction, but would go on to serve and represent this area in the U.S. Congress after the end of Reconstruction. One biographer outlined the factors that influenced his political career as being his experience with living in a frontier culture, his embrace of conservative Whig political ideology, his belief in white supremacy, this racial order, this social order we'll talk about, and his desire to stimulate economic development in North Texas. I think it's a pretty apt description. Reconstruction was the time period after the Civil War where our country grappled with what vision to set for the future. Historian David Blight categorizes these visions into three groups. There was a group he called the Emancipationists, who followed the example of Abraham Lincoln and included Ulysses S. Grant, Frederick Douglass, freedmen, and most of the Republican Party at the time. The group advocated for full rights to be granted to freedmen, including suffrage and equal protection under the law. They were opposed by a group originally led by President Andrew Johnson and included most Southern Democrats and ex-Confederates like James Throckmorton. As mentioned, this group sought a social order that denied full rights to freedmen, including suffrage and equal protection under the law, a form of second-class citizenship for African Americans. The third group was known as reconciliationists, and they prioritized the healing of the country over either of the two social orders. We know that the group that sought to maintain some form of social order based on race ultimately wins in setting the vision for the country. Ex-Confederates like Throckmorton regained their political power across the South, and the country would begin decades of segregation, discrimination, disenfranchisement, and extrajudicial terror that could be seen across the South, in Texas, and in Collin County. A social order that Throckmorton had established in Texas as governor, and that our society would begin to rally around and celebrate throughout the South and beyond. After Reconstruction, the country turned to reconciliation, reunion, and redemption. We see the emergence of remembrances like Memorial Day. We see the practice of veteran reunions with organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic and the United Confederate Veterans. And we see the attempt to redeem the Confederacy by reimagining and rewriting history. This narrative of redemption was part of what is known as the lost cause of the Confederacy. It pushed ideas like the cause of the Confederacy was heroic and just. It takes the Confederacy, a coalition that's built on slavery and white supremacy, that rebelled against the United States and ultimately lost, and finds reason to celebrate. The United Confederate Veterans and their affiliated group The United Daughters of the Confederacy, the UCV and UDC, played a major part in pushing this narrative. They led the charge to erect Confederate monuments throughout the South, in city centers and on courthouse lawns. These monuments celebrated the Confederacy and its ideals, and in that reinforced this racial social order that we keep talking about. The placements of these monuments had purpose and intent. Some say that McKinney doesn't have a Confederate monument like that. Maybe we didn't take part. The National UDC doesn't claim anything here. The Southern Poverty Law Center doesn't list McKinney as having a Confederate monument. Perhaps McKinney is unique and decided not to take part in this celebration that was happening across North Texas. But unfortunately, that's not the case. McKinney had a very active UCV and UDC. In fact, the local Confederate veteran camp was known as the Throckmorton Camp after his death. And in 1904, the Throckmorton Camp established a committee to take over the fundraising for the monument to their fellow Confederate Throckmorton. A friend and former partner of Throckmorton had tried to raise money to place a monument, but only had the funds to place the pedestal in 1899. And Mayor Pro Tem Rogers, you can see the missing pedestal, or the missing statue there. But he was unable to complete it before his death. The UCV would spend years raising money for this monument. They would mention it at their annual reunions, including when they had the head of the Texas UDC, Katie Dolphin, here to advocate for the monument. They engaged the community to join the effort. They even started a campaign to get school kids to donate nickels. The UDC was always a part of this effort with their affiliation to the UCV, but they made a formal announcement here in 1910. The City Federation of Women announced their involvement in 1909 and ultimately are listed as the presenter of the monument when it was dedicated in 1911. Some will try to point to this as evidence that it is not a UDC monument, but these organizations were intertwined. In fact, when the City Federation announced their involvement in 1909, their president was a lady that had helped found the local chapter of the UDC and had been a longtime officer of both groups. And at this presentation, 3 of the 4 speakers had been part of the local UCV, including the mayor, known as Colonel Doggett, from his service in the Confederacy. The mayor had also served on the Throckmorton Committee since 1904. So to say that this is not a UDC monument because of the role of the City Federation is a distinction without a difference. You see, these celebrations and this social order was not isolated to some fringe part of society. This social order that was being celebrated would not be sustainable if it did not include the majority of people. It's just that in McKinney, our Confederate was a man who made good decisions and bad decisions. But the monument and the celebration had the same intent and purpose we see across the South. The legacy of Throckmorton is not merely a monument on our former courthouse lawn. While the monument had intent and purpose, it is the actual racial social order he sought to maintain as a Confederate general and reestablish as governor that has had a greater impact on our community than the statue. As you know, McKinney has a history of segregation and discrimination that didn't end with the integration of schools in 1965. It didn't end with when the segregated restrooms were removed from the courthouse or the downtown lunch counters were integrated. It didn't end with the establishment of geographic council districts in 1977 after an agreement with the Department of Justice to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And it didn't end in 2015 when the Housing Authority fulfilled a consent decree in a fair housing case in order to address geographic housing segregation in this city. Like most communities, we still have disparate outcomes in housing, education, income, criminal justice, and many more. These are remnants and scars that can be tied back directly to a vision set after Reconstruction and a social order that was established by men like James Throckmorton and then celebrated by the UCV and UDC. Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative and the book and movie Just Mercy talks about this social order a lot. Excuse me. He notes that the true evil of slavery was not the enslavement of millions of African Americans, but the narrative of difference that was used to justify it. This narrative meant that after emancipation and the end of the Civil War, slavery evolved into this new social order that subjugated African Americans to the segregation and discrimination of Jim Crow. We never dealt with the narrative. He goes on to say that we really didn't deal with the narrative after the Civil Rights Movement, and we've seen it evolve again into mass incarceration. I would add to that and say we've allowed this narrative to affect how we look at all of these disparate outcomes, not just criminal justice. Our society seems to see these outcomes as inevitable or unavoidable, and it clouds the fact that they were designed and created. I mentioned earlier that Governor Throckmorton refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, which provided citizenship and equal protection under the law. He refused to ratify it. And he went further than that. He chose to pass black codes, which were laws were intended to form a second class of citizenship, one that many described as slavery by another name. This social order was designed, it was a choice, and it was celebrated. And as a community, we can let the celebration of that choice stand in our town center, or we can work to deal with these outcomes, and we can work to change this narrative. In order to address this in our community on this issue, I think there needs to be justice in how we try to right these wrongs, in trying to point and move in a better direction. We need to have mercy in remembering and appreciating Throckmorton's role in the good that came from his work in the area's development. And we need to walk forward with humility by listening to each other and forging paths together. We have to recognize and understand how this social order has caused us harm and the ways in which we let this harm perpetuate. Whether through this social order or its symbolism, its continued existence makes us subject to that harm, both as the oppressed and as the oppressor. So I represent a perspective held by 5 members of your appointed committee. I'm sure you've deduced that our recommendation is to relocate the statue. We think an appropriate place is within the Collin County History Museum, just 2 blocks down the street in a building that was dedicated the same year as the monument. Placement in the museum accomplishes a few things. It removes him from a place of honor, off his pedestal, and out of our town square. It provides protection to the statue as an object, but also to our community and the division it has created and has the potential to create. It allows context and education to be provided, which will hopefully point people to the impacts Throckmorton had and the social order he helped to create. It allows information to be included on the lost cause and the efforts of the UCV and UDC. It is a way to better understand our history, not erase it as some would claim. And while we recognize that the Throckmorton Monument is an object, and relocating it doesn't solve any problems in and of itself, I hope that just like the placement of the monument carried intent, the relocation of it does as well. We hope it symbolizes the steps this community has taken and will continue to take to address the remnants and scars we have and the harm they cause us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Justin.